Is Monk Rowe, and we're filming in San Diego, California for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. I'm pleased to have a saxophonist from overseas, and welcome Jim Galloway.
Thank you, Mike.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I enjoyed your playing for the last couple days.
Yeah, we've been having some fun.
Yeah, been some swinging sets down there. Enjoyed seeing that little curved soprano.
Yeah, it's my baby.
Yeah. Why the curved and not the straight? Was that a...
Well, I have both.
Yeah.
I have a very, very lovely straight soprano and nice old con. I prefer most of the time to use the curved horn because probably because of the fact that it is curved, it changes the tonal quality of the horn, and it's a mellower tone than the straight horn, which can be a little nasal in its quality.
Yeah.
And it's a little more saxophone sounding.
Yeah.
So
it projects surprisingly well for its mellowness.
Yeah.
I could hear it from the back of the room down there.
Yeah, it cuts through quite well.
And I think a little easier to carry around too, I think.
Just a
on and
little
off
bit.
the planes.
Yeah,
You can set it right in your lap.
Yeah, it goes everywhere.
Is it an old instrument?
Yes, it's a 1924 con.
Yeah.
And
Is it low pitched by any chance?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's low pitch. And I've tried some of the new horns, which have great facility. They're very fast. This one's, you know, a little slower, but
it's got more experience.
That's right. And it's got the, I don't know, there's a tonal quality to the old horns that you'll find most of us prefer.
Yeah. Well, especially fits the music.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're from Scotland, and I don't know if I can pronounce, I'll try, Kilwinning?
Well, yeah, I was only there very briefly. I was born there in a nursing home, but my home and where I grew up was a little town 4 miles from there called Dalry. And that's where I grew up before I moved into Glasgow when I was a student.
Okay. You probably know Joe Temperley.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What was the music like that you heard as a youth? Do you remember specific?
Oh, I remember a great deal of it because I was born in 1936. So by the time I was becoming conscious of music, the war was just over. But the American Forces Network was going strong in Europe. And so I tuned in. I mean, the radio was the thing. I lived for the radio because that's, of course, where I first heard jazz. And there was quite a bit of it on BBC, played, of course, by local bands, some of which were pretty good. But I had the huge advantage of being able to tune in the American Forces Network. And there was, in particular, now I never have known what happened to this guy. I remember his name. He was on late every night out of Frankfurt. His name was Joe Neidig. His theme song was Artie Shaw's Nightmare. And he played a lot of really good music. And so I cut my teeth in a lot of stuff that way.
This man was a DJ, not a band leader.
No, he was a DJ.
Okay.
He was a DJ.
Yeah.
He was amazing, though, because a daunting sort of task he must have had every day, because he would have conversations between the records that he played. He'd maybe play a conversation out of a radio drama. It might be The Whistler or you know.
Yeah.
And he would have a conversation with tape. It must have taken him all day, because in those days it was splicing with a razor blade, right? To edit tape. It was great. It was great. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, I also was able to tune in the Voice of America with Willis Conover. And that's where I heard a huge amount of the great jazz that I became so familiar with. And it was funny, later on, once I'd moved to Toronto, one year I did a show for, there's an event there once a year called Caravan, and each nation takes a pavilion and they put on various things. And one year the American embassy put on a pavilion, and they engaged me to do the music, and it was very jazz-oriented. And the lady who was in charge of it, who was at that time with the U.S., American Embassy in Toronto, had been Willis Conover's secretary.
Wow.
I mean, I couldn't believe this.
There's a
The
coincidence for
woo-woo.
you. Yeah. Wow. You came all the way over here, and boy, how'd that work?
Yeah. So my early influences were the radio, and everything from Louis Armstrong to Charlie Parker. I listened to it all.
Yeah.
So I developed very Catholic tastes at a very early age, because I was fortunate that I had, we bought a new radio, and I managed to get the old one in my bedroom. And so at a very early age, when I was supposed to be sleeping, I had
The jazz
AFN
on
and
there.
Willis Conover on,
Yeah.
and I'm lying there in the dark listening to all this.
Yeah. I
when
can
should have
relate
been
to
asleep,
that.
you know.
Yep. I've heard
And to
that
this
story
day, I don't
before.
sleep a lot.
Wow. And was the saxophone your first instrument of choice?
Clarinet.
Was it? Oh, yeah. Okay.
And that came purely by accident. I had one of my pals in Dorai. I was in his home one day, and they had a tremendous collection of musical instruments all over the place. And he happened to say, "Would you like to borrow a clarinet?" I said, "Sure, I'd love to." If he had said trombone, I would have tried to be a trombone player.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah.
so that's how it all began.
Cool. What you moved to Canada in what year?
1964.
So you
On the 4th of July,
Wow.
1964.
That's an easy date to
It was
remember.
some sort of personal statement.
Yeah, I
guess.
don't know. You must have done a certain amount of playing in Scotland
Oh,
before
yeah.
you came over.
Yeah, I did a lot of playing. Yeah.
Was it in small groups or big bands?
No, it was small groups.
Mhm.
It was small groups. And played, I mean, in the late 50s, jazz had a huge revival over there, and it was on the charts. I mean, there was all kinds of traditionally oriented music that was hit parade music. So there was quite a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I played mostly around the Glasgow area, and with a lot of different groups. And the styles of the band were pretty traditional, although at one time I went to art school in Glasgow. And while I was in art school, I had this quintet with a very close friend of mine who went to art school with me. His name was Andy Park, and he ended up in television. But we had this quintet. It was the baritone, trombone, piano, bass, drums, and we played monk music, Thelonious Monk tunes.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
as I say, I've always had a very sort of broad acceptance of
Uh-huh.
music. And nowadays, in my leisure time, I listen a lot to classical.
Mm-hmm.
It's another aspect of the music.
So were you playing still in Scotland now? Was it for dances or jazz clubs or
Both.
Both.
Both. Glasgow at that time was dance crazy. There were, I don't know how many dance halls going 5-6 nights a week in Glasgow at that time.
Oh.
I know that there was employment for 4 or 5 big bands 6 nights a week.
Wow.
And
That's
then,
a
of
lot.
course, the onslaught of television killed it, as it's
Thank you.
done its stuff all over the place.
Yeah. The dancing that they were doing, was it the dances of, let me rephrase the question. Were they doing the Lindy Hop and all that kind of stuff, or was it more?
It was, most of it was pretty straight ahead, sort of body contact dancing,
Yeah.
old-fashioned dancing. You know.
Yeah, okay.
And there were always a few people, especially in a jazz club, who would be into doing some jitterbug
Mhm.
dancing,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So,
Okay, so,
and I've never
Thank you.
minded that, because the music is essentially a communication with people.
uh-huh.
And so, and in its origins, a lot of people danced to the music. So it's never been
Absolutely.
a problem for me to have people dancing.
Yeah. Sometimes it helps.
Sure.
You can see what they respond to
Yeah.
and shift your tempos to really get
Yeah.
the thing happening. So early 60s, was the decision to come over here a long one? Was it something that you thought about for a long time?
Oh, I guess I did. It's hard to recall. I obviously didn't just wake up one morning and say, well, I'm going
Yeah,
to Canada.
yeah.
I thought about it. And a lot of people have said, why Toronto? And to put it all in perspective, in the mid-60s, if you had a half-decent education and if you were qualified in some sort of acceptable profession, and you see, I had a degree from an art school. As a jazz musician, they might not have wanted me, but
Right.
I did have this
Uh-huh.
this funny little piece of paper. Anyway, and in the mid-60s, they welcomed people such as myself with open arms. It was more difficult, as it still is, to get entry into the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And Toronto seemed like a good spot because it was essentially still a strong British influence, and it was real close to New York.
Yeah, yeah.
so boom, Toronto it was.
Cool. Was it any kind of culture shock at all, or was it fairly?
Oh yeah,
Was
a little bit. The first shock was the very first night I arrived. Again, at that time, in Glasgow, for example, you didn't go into a bar to hear jazz. They didn't have music in bars as they have here. And so on my first night in Toronto, I was on Yonge Street, which is the main drag. And there's this place I see called the Colonial Tavern. And so I go in there and I literally stopped in my tracks because on the bandstand there was Vic Dickinson, Buster Bailey, Herman Autry, Red Richards on piano. I mean, it's what is it? I mean, I've died and gone to heaven. You know?
Wow.
And so that was my first shock.
That was a
The
pretty
first
good
night I arrived, and it was
a good
wonderful.
affirmation of your decision, though, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
Hey, I did the right thing.
Yeah. And subsequently, never worked with Buster. He died shortly after that, but I became very good friends with Vic Dickinson. I'm still a good friend of Red Richards. Herman I played with. He's unfortunately, well, like most of them, departed. But Vic was a very huge influence on me. And I find that a lot of my influences have not necessarily been reed players.
Have not been part.
Reed players all the time.
Yeah, okay.
I learned a huge amount about the business just playing beside people like Vic Dickinson and Bobby Hackett, for
Yeah.
example.
So Toronto was a stop for those guys on their crisscrossing of the country.
Yeah, at that time there was a reasonable circuit, and clubs could still afford to bring in groups. Travel wasn't as horrendously expensive as it's become, and there were traveling groups. And the Colonial and the Town Tavern were the two spots in Toronto in those days that brought in musicians. And I saw just a huge procession of great players who would come through the town. Toronto always was a very good jazz town. Still is.
They have a big festival up there every year, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you employ your art degree
Yeah.
in Toronto?
Sure, I worked as a designer
Uh-huh.
initially because in those days I had been a member of the Musicians' Union in Britain. And in those days, I didn't know this, but I went to the local and said I was a member of the MU and I'd come to Canada. I'd like to transfer and join the local in Toronto. And I'll never forget the secretary treasurer of the local at that time was a man called Walter Murdoch, another Scot, and he told me to bugger off and come back in a year because
Did he really?
you had to have a year's residence to
Yeah.
become a member. So, of course, I did play, but sort of under-the-table gigs.
Wow. Well,
And I
that's
got a-
even
and I
worse
got a day job.
than in New York. I think it was 6 months.
Yeah, and it's changed now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's much easier now, I think.
He told you to bugger off, huh?
Yeah. Actually, he put it even more strongly
No
than
kidding. Gee.
that. And my jaw dropped.
Wow.
That's just his way.
Just doing the union job.
Yeah.
Wow. So how did you establish yourself as a player in Toronto?
Sat in with a lot of groups.
Yeah.
Then started getting calls for gigs.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 years after I'd been there, I formed a little group of my own. And, you know, yeah, it's been downhill from there.
Yeah. How long did you keep up your crafts, your artwork?
Oh, let's see now. I guess I was on the road first time around a full time in the late 60s. In the early 70s, there was a bit of a nosedive for music, and I went back to my art background and was sort of combining that and playing. And then a couple of years, or 3 years or so after that, I went back into it full time, and it's been like that ever since.
Cool. How did you go about meeting these wonderful fellas, Buddy Tate and Jay McShann?
Wow.
And
Well, Buddy I met for the first time when he was touring in Britain, and he came to Glasgow in '58, and we met at a party afterwards. Jay, that came about because a club opened in '72, I think it was, called Bourbon Street, and in its first couple of years or so, or year and a half, I booked the club, and I discovered to my amazement that Jay McShann had never played Toronto.
oh,
And so I met Jay simply because I phoned him and asked him if he'd like to come up to Toronto and play. And it was the beginning, well, you know,
yeah, that's cool.
the end of Casablanca when Bogart and Rain said, you know, this could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Yeah.
Well, that's what it was. It was the beginning of a really close friendship. And Jay and I have been very, very good friends ever since.
That's interesting. I bet it was probably really neat the first time you called him. I heard his voice on the phone.
Yeah. So,
That kind of Kansas City thing he has is hard to reproduce, and I don't know if it's.
oh, he's a one-off now. I mean, he's it.
Yeah. When was the last time you got to play with him?
Last summer, and well, as we speak, this is what, mid-February of '98. I'm doing a week with him week after next.
Oh, great.
So I was
Great.
talking to him last week.
Yeah.
And
Did you know that you have a pretty nice entry in the Grove Dictionary of
I
Jazz?
know there's an entry in there. I
Yeah.
don't have the book, but I know
It's,
there's an entry.
One thing they say is plays soprano sax in a lyrical style reminiscent of Sidney Bechet.
Well, I guess anybody who's ever decided to play soprano sax, if they're at all aware of the origins of the music, they have to have heard Bechet.
Mm-hmm.
He was, after all, he was the first great saxophone soloist in jazz.
Yeah,
Statement made.
right.
And I don't think I particularly played like him, but you absorb influences,
Mhm.
and certainly his are in there. I listened a lot to him. I saw him once live when he toured in Britain obviously before I left, and I was transfixed by his playing. The hairs in the back of my neck actually stood up, and I walked out of that concert totally changed. You know?
Oh.
there was a tremendous emotional impact in his playing, which you just cannot capture on record, no matter how great the records might be. So just the experience of having heard him in the flesh, woo, blew me away.
Was he playing only soprano then, or was he
Yeah.
playing the clarinet at all?
No, he was playing soprano then.
Yeah.
And of course the straight.
The straight one.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a statement. Can you describe what it was about his playing that had such an emotional impact?
Oh, there's an intensity to it, and actually this is interesting. His centenary was last year, and I was invited to New Orleans to be part of a panel discussion, and played in a street parade,
Oh,
which
wow.
was great. And one of the things that I commented on, because I think he doesn't receive perhaps the recognition that he could have, and I think in a sense it may have been because, and this is only a little theory of mine, but when he played, he really pierced your emotions, and that can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. You know, I mean, and I know that to me, he's got right in here, and as I say,
Yeah.
like, and it was the intensity of his playing. He was a marvelous harmonic player. I mean, he had a wonderful harmonic concept, and great lines, and a lot of people found that high vibrato a little difficult to take, but even if you listen beyond that to what the guy was playing, it was so powerful.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, I had the same experience hearing Louis Armstrong. I mean, for me, just to hear Louis play a middle C, I mean, it was magic. So those sort of things, they stay with you, and obviously they leave their mark. And I think that emotional aspect of the music is so important. And for me, it's the difference between a good wine and a glass of Blanc. That magic thing that's there, and the great ones have it.
Yeah. Who are the great ones today that have it?
Oh, that's a hard one, because you have to put different sort of parameters on the music. I mean, it's very difficult to put people in compartments, I find, but critics in particular were very fond of creating these categories that people would fit into. But jazz has become so multifaceted now that it's very difficult, I think, to define it. No, it's impossible to define it.
Yeah.
There are some of the younger players that move me, and Ray Anderson moves me. He's one of the younger trombone players, and knows the roots of the music.
I'm sorry, say
He
again.
knows the roots of the music.
Yeah.
He knows its origins, and he's a very contemporary player. But to me, he's full of that passion and emotion and all the magic things. And Ray does it for me. And I'm sure I could think of a bunch more. Roy Hargrove's a very great young trumpet player. And again, he's got this, it's like a fanaticism about playing.
Yeah.
You know, he's got this huge passionate desire to play the horn. And I don't want to idealize that sort of thing. I don't mean to get over a message. Oh, it's so wonderful to be able to play, and it's, well, you know, of course there are many other aspects to it, and business aspect being one of them. You have to be able to take care of business. but the musicians who can do that or have someone who can help them, but also have this magic thing going for them, those are the ones that do it for me.
Yeah.
I could come up with a lot of, I mean, on piano, I love Kenny Barron's playing, and he has a sound. You know, piano's an inanimate sort of,
Yeah.
but Kenny Barron sounds like Kenny Barron.
Uh-huh.
And oh gosh, there are, it would take a long time. It took me a little time just to distill out some of the ones that
but
really get to me.
there's still some around that
Yeah,
really
sure
do it
there are.
for you.
Of course there are.
You're not one of the people who, occasionally I hear, you know, nobody's playing anything new today. Nobody's got a personality on their horn today. A lot of people complain that the music schools are just turning out people who play with great abundance of technique. And
yeah, and I'm one of the ones that has leveled that concern, because I'm not at all sure that whether it be Berkeley or Humber College in Toronto, there's some aspect of a production line here.
Mm-hmm.
And you're learning certainly how to run the changes in any key and do all sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily make you a real jazz player.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's a very fair criticism.
Well, what are they leaving out in the education? And is it possible
Well,
to show people that?
No, what's left out is there's no training ground. You know, you can't get your experience the same way that the early giants got it, by playing in groups here, there, everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and absorbing influences from a lot of different people.
Yeah.
You go to a college for 4 years, and the influences you're absorbing are the ones who happen to be in that college. And great they may be, and great teachers they may be, but the broad range of experience isn't there that you absorb from all sorts of different areas.
Yeah. It's an unrealistic playing situation to be in without getting out in the clubs. And it's too bad that that atmosphere is not around anymore.
Yeah. Yes, it is. But
Well, let's listen. I just wanted to listen to
oops.
a little piece of one of your recordings. Now, you managed to get Jay McShann and Jay Canna on this record. I'm not as familiar with Fraser McPherson. Is he a...
Fraser McPherson was a marvelous tenor saxophone player who was from Vancouver.
Uh-huh.
And he and I made a couple of CDs together, the one with the big band and another one of a concert in Switzerland. And we'd known each other for many years, and unfortunately his last 2 recordings were the ones he did with me, and passed on. And Jake and Jay are buddies.
Yeah.
Right?
Jake's a character, all right.
Yes, yes indeed.
Is there a big band scene still in Toronto, or is it kind of an effort to mount every performance?
It's tough to get the bands playing, because the practical aspect of it is more difficult. It's more expensive to hire 17 PCs.
Yeah.
But there are in Toronto several really good big bands. There's the Boss Brass, of course, which comes from there. And at the other end of the spectrum, playing in this style is my own band. But in between, there's Dave McMurdo has a very good band. There's quite a successful, if somewhat commercial, big band, a tribute to Glenn Miller band, but it's getting work. And there's the Spitfire, there's Brigham Phillips big band. I mean, there's half a dozen really good big bands around up there. They're not all working.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, I rehearse the band. We get a handful of gigs every year,
Yeah.
and the enthusiasm is there.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Good. These jazz parties that you come to, do they have such a thing in Canada?
Not really. Not in the same way. There was one gentleman who tried for a couple of years in Toronto. It didn't quite work. The festivals seem to have a bigger impact in Canada. There are jazz festivals across the country, from Halifax to Victoria. And unfortunately, in a sense, the jazz festival is about the only way that you can get to see some groups nowadays because of the economics.
Yeah.
Although Toronto's very fortunate in that there's a steady stream of great musicians passing through the city. We're very lucky. There's much more activity in Toronto year-round than there is any place else in Canada.
Mm-hmm. How do you like playing with these rather, what kind of like semi-organized jam sessions at the parties? Is it mostly enjoyable?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We have a pretty good time.
Uh-huh.
I think it shows.
It does.
And it's a relatively small circle of musicians, and you establish friendships,
Yeah.
and so it becomes a pleasant social 3 or 4 days, as well as musically stimulating too.
Yeah.
So it's nice.
Mm-hmm. What's in the near future for you?
For me, oh, I've got some jobs around the Toronto area coming up, including, as I said, a week with Jay. Then I've got several trips back into the States this year again. I'll be in Europe at least a couple of times. I go there immediately after the Toronto Festival to a festival in Switzerland, and I'm back in Europe in the fall. So, you know, it's not bad.
Do your own business dealings?
Mostly,
Yeah.
yeah. Although, if I'm doing stuff for Run Britain, say, there's a lovely guy there called Brian Peerless, and he looks after things for a bunch of us who are on the circuit.
Yeah.
So, but really, there's not the money in it for a really aggressive agent to make a living from it.
Right.
The money that exists in the pop world just is not in our world.
Yeah.
And that's not all bad, because, you know, if it were pop music, it would lose something.
Yes, it would.
But it would be nice if it were just a little healthier than it is.
Yeah, a little bit. And
Yeah.
I think that if it were in the megabuck range, that I don't think the musicians would be as nice people as they are either.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not.
I don't
Yeah.
know. But well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I've
If you
enjoyed
had
it.
if you had an acquaintance, let's say a nephew or something like that, who was an aspiring jazz musician, said, "I really want to do this for a living,"
Well,
what would you honestly say to that person?
well, I've gone into schools quite a lot. I have a little thing that I call Jazzmobile Jam. And I go in and I talk about the music, and I play, show them how it's done
Yeah.
in basic terms. I always say, unless you have the passion, unless it's something you just absolutely must do, don't. And I mean that,
Yeah.
because you have to have that fire in your gut, otherwise the business will destroy you.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well spoken.
Well, I believe it.
Yeah. I can't recall who it was, but someone said that jazz is like having an illness, you know. You really have to do it.
Yeah.
Said, you know.
Yeah, and the highs are like nothing else you'll ever know. But to enjoy those, there's an awful lot of A lot of the time that's downtime.
Yeah. Well, best of luck to you in your travels and
Thank you.
for the rest of the festival.
Okay.
And I love that horn, and hope you keep it in good shape.
Well, I'll do my best.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to be good to it because it's good to me.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Mike.